My name is Lena Hartwell, and I was 18 the night my father set my suitcase on the porch and told me a pregnant girl wasn't welcome under his roof anymore. I stood in the rain holding a positive test and a backpack of textbooks, and my mother watched from the window and didn't move. 17 years later, they drove 4 hours to my front door asking me for the one thing I'd spent half my life building. They had no idea what they were walking into. Let me take you back to the house on Birchwood Lane, because you need to understand the air in that house before you'll understand anything that came after. I grew up the only child of Carl and Deborah Hartwell, in a brick 2-story with a flag on the porch and a lawn my father mowed in perfect diagonal stripes every Saturday morning at exactly 9. Carl ran the parts counter at a regional auto distributor for 26 years, the kind of job where you get a watch at the end and a pension that barely covers the heating bill. Deborah taught 3rd grade. Between them, they built a life that looked, from the street, like the picture of order. Inside, it ran on one rule that never got written down because it didn't have to be. You did not embarrass this family. That was the whole religion. Not love, not honesty, appearance. I was a good kid by any measure that mattered to them. Honor roll. Church youth group. I didn't drink, didn't sneak out, didn't give them a single thing to explain to the neighbors. I tell you that not to make myself sound virtuous, but because it matters for what happened next. I had spent 18 years being exactly the daughter they wanted, and it still wasn't enough to buy me one conversation when I needed it most. I met Daniel Voss the summer before my senior year, at the community pool where I lifeguarded 3 afternoons a week. He was 19, working construction with his uncle, saving for a community college program in HVAC repair. He wasn't flashy. He carried a thermos of his grandmother's sun tea and knew the names of every bird that landed on the chain-link fence around the pool deck. We dated quietly for almost a year, and my parents knew about him the way they knew about most things in my life. At a polite distance, never asked about directly, never invited fully into the house. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in March of my senior year, 2 months before graduation. I sat on the edge of the bathtub at Daniel's apartment and watched the second line appear, and I felt the floor of my whole future tilt sideways. I want to be honest with you about that morning, because the version of me sitting there was not brave. I was terrified. I was 18, I had a partial scholarship to the state university sitting in a folder on my desk, and I had no idea yet what kind of father Carl Hartwell would turn out to be, because I had never tested that question before. I had never needed to. Daniel was steady about it in a way that surprised me. He didn't run. He sat next to me on the edge of that tub and said, Okay, we figure this out together." That sentence carried me through the next 2 weeks more than anything else did. I told my parents on a Sunday evening, after dinner, the way you're supposed to do hard things calm, prepared, sitting down at the kitchen table where the good light from the window made everything look softer than it was. I had practiced the words in the mirror. I'm pregnant. I know this isn't what you wanted for me. I want to finish school. I have a plan. My father set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way you set something down right before you throw something else. My mother's hand went to her mouth, and her first words were not "Are you okay?" or "What do you need?" Her first words were, "What will people at church say?" That sentence told me everything about the next 10 minutes before they happened. My father stood up from the table. He didn't yell at first. That was almost worse. He talked in the flat, controlled voice he used when he was building toward something, the voice that meant the real explosion was still loading. He asked whose idea this was, like a pregnancy was a prank somebody had cooked up. He asked if Daniel's family knew. He asked, and this is the line I have never been able to fully forgive, whether I'd done this on purpose to trap a husband because I wasn't smart enough to make it on my own merits. I sat very still and let him talk, because I had learned a long time ago that interrupting Carl Hartwell mid-sentence only restarted the clock. My mother cried, but her crying wasn't for me. She kept saying, "How could you do this to us?" To us, like the baby growing inside me was an act of vandalism against her reputation specifically. She talked about the women's group at church, about my aunt who never let her hear the end of it, about the graduation party they'd already half planned with the neighbors invited. I asked them, quietly, what they wanted me to do. I wasn't asking permission to keep the baby. I want to be clear about that. I was asking what kind of family we were going to be going forward. It was the wrong question to ask people who had already decided the answer. My father left the kitchen and came back 4 minutes later with a suitcase, my suitcase, the one from summer camp with the faded daisy sticker on the side. He set it on the kitchen table, not gently, and he said the sentence I have carried in my chest for 17 years like a stone I never put down. You made your choice. Now go make your bed somewhere else. I asked if I could at least finish out the school year from home, since graduation was 8 weeks away. He said image mattered more than my diploma at this point, that having a visibly pregnant girl walking around the neighborhood for 2 more months wasn't something he was willing to explain to people. My mother didn't argue with him. She stood by the window with her arms crossed, and when I looked at her, hopping for one crack in the wall, she turned her face away and looked out at the dark yard instead. I carried that suitcase out onto the porch myself. It was raining, a thin, cold March rain that soaked through my sweatshirt in minutes. I stood there for a long moment, half expecting the door to open behind me, half expecting somebody to call my name. Nobody did. I heard the deadbolt turn. That sound, the particular click of a lock sliding home, is something I still hear sometimes in quiet rooms, even now, even happy. I called Daniel from the bus stop bench 2 blocks away, soaked through, shaking, and he came and got me in his uncle's truck within 15 minutes. No questions, just the heater turned up high and his hand on my knee the whole drive. That was the night I stopped being Carl and Deborah Hartwell's daughter in any way that meant something. I was still their daughter on paper. I would not be their daughter in any way that counted again for a very long time. If you've ever had the people who were supposed to protect you decide that how things looked mattered more than how you actually were, you already know exactly the kind of cold I'm describing. Stay with me, because the next 17 years took that cold and built something warm and solid out of it, board by board. And what happened when they finally came back is the whole reason I'm telling you this story tonight. Daniel's mother, Pearl, took us in without a single condition attached. She had raised Daniel alone after his father left, working double shifts at a regional hospital laundry service, and she knew exactly what it looked like when a young woman needed a door that opened instead of one that locked. She gave us the back bedroom of her small rental house, helped me enroll in night classes to finish my diploma through an alternative program, and never once, not one single time in 17 years, made me feel like a burden for needing her. I finished high school 4 months late, walking in a small evening ceremony with 11 other students, instead of the big graduation my parents had been so worried about explaining to the neighbors. Pearl came. Daniel came. Nobody from Birchwood Lane did. My daughter, Marin, was born that August, 6 pounds 2 ounces, with Daniel's calm temperament and my stubborn chin. I held her in a hospital room with cheap fluorescent lighting and a view of a parking garage, and I made her a promise out loud, the kind of promise you only make once in your life and mean all the way down. I told her she would never once in her life wonder if she was wanted. I want to be honest about the years that came after, because they were not a fairy tale. Daniel and I got married the following spring in Pearl's backyard, 20 guests, a borrowed grill, and a homemade cake that leaned slightly to one side. We were broke in the specific, grinding way that only young parents understand, counting diapers against gas money. Learning which grocery store marked down the bread at exactly 7 p.m., Daniel finished his HVAC certification and started picking up service calls on nights and weekends while working his regular shift. I took community college classes 2 at a time, child psychology and elementary education, because somewhere in those long nights walking Marin around the apartment, I had decided I wanted to spend my life making sure other people's children never felt the way I'd felt standing on that porch in the rain. My parents called exactly twice in the first 2 years. Once was my mother, 3 weeks after Marin was born, asking in a tight, careful voice whether I was doing okay, and when I told her the baby's name and asked if she wanted to come see her, she said she'd need to talk to your father about it, and I never heard back. The second call was from my father, 18 months later, and it lasted 90 seconds. He told me he hoped I'd learned something from all this and asked if I needed money in the same breath, like the two things were related. I told him no. He said good and hung up. I stopped waiting for the third call somewhere around year 3. That's a specific kind of grief, the day you stop checking the driveway. Nobody throws you a card for it. You just notice one ordinary Tuesday that you've stopped listening for a car door. Daniel and I had a second child, a son named Eli, when Marin was 4. By then, Daniel had started his own small HVAC service company, just him and one van at first, then him and 3 employees by the time Eli started kindergarten. I finished my degree the slow way, 1 or 2 classes a semester for 6 years, and started substitute teaching the year Eli went into 1st grade, then took a permanent position the following fall at a public elementary school 20 minutes from our house. I want to pause here because the next part of this story isn't a dramatic turn. It's just years. Steady, unremarkable years, the kind that don't make good highlight reels but build the actual structure of a life. Daniel's company grew slowly, the honest way, on word of mouth and fair pricing, and showing up when he said he would. By the time Marin was in middle school, he had 11 employees and a real office, not just a van and a phone number. I became the school's lead reading specialist, then the assistant principal at 34, the kind of promotion that comes from a decade of quietly doing good work and showing up for kids nobody else wanted to deal with. We bought a house, a real one, 4 bedrooms on a cul-de-sac with a swing set Daniel built himself in a single Saturday. We weren't rich. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about $100 million or a stunning inheritance. This is a story about something smaller and, in its way, harder to build. An ordinary, solid, warm life built entirely by 2 people who had been told by at least one set of parents that they would amount to nothing. Pearl lived to see both of her grandchildren grow into teenagers before she passed peacefully in her sleep at 71. We buried her on a clear October afternoon, and at the funeral, my daughter, then 16, stood up unprompted and told a room full of relative strangers that her grandma Pearl was the only grandmother she'd ever really had, and that she was the bravest person she'd ever met, because she opened a door for 2 scared kids and never once asked them to pay her back for it. I cried harder at that funeral than I had at almost anything else in my adult life, not just from grief, but from the strange, aching gratitude of watching my own child understand, at 16, the exact lesson it had taken me years to fully absorb. My parents did not come to that funeral. They had never met Pearl. I never gave them the chance, and by then, I didn't want to. Over those 17 years, there were exactly 3 points of contact with Birchwood Lane, and I want to walk you through each one, because they matter for what happened at my front door. The first was a Christmas card, the year Marin turned 7, addressed simply to the Hartwell-Voss family, with a printed photo of my parents on a cruise ship and a generic holiday message inside, no note, no mention of either grandchild by name. I kept it for exactly as long as it took to read it once, then put it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but out of the same instinct that makes you keep a receipt. You don't always know yet why you're keeping something. Sometimes you just are. The second was a phone call from my mother when Marin was 11, out of nowhere, on an ordinary Wednesday evening. She'd heard from a cousin that Daniel had started a little business, and she wanted to know how it was doing. Not how the children were doing, not how I was doing, how the business was doing. I gave her a short, polite answer and changed the subject, and she let the conversation die without much resistance, like she'd gotten the one piece of information she'd actually called for. The third was a wedding invitation I sent them when Daniel and I renewed our vows for our 15th anniversary, a small backyard gathering, the kind of thing you send to people out of obligation more than hope. They didn't come. They didn't respond at all. The envelope simply never came back, and the silence said everything the words would have. I tell you all of this not to paint myself as a saint who never thought of them. I thought of them plenty, especially in the early years, especially watching Daniel's mother hold my bobbies the way my own mother never had. But somewhere around year 10, the thinking stopped hurting in the sharp way and started feeling more like an old scar, the kind you only notice if someone presses on it directly. Nobody pressed on it again until the spring Marin turned 17. If you've ever built an entire life specifically as proof that the people who wrote you off were wrong, you already understand the particular kind of armor I'd grown by then. Stay with me, because the doorbell that rang on an ordinary Thursday evening was about to test every inch of it, and what I found on the other side of that door was not what either of us expected. It was a Thursday in April, just after 6 in the evening. Daniel was finishing a late service call across town. I was in the kitchen helping Eli, then 13, with a fraction worksheet while Marin sat at the counter scrolling through college brochures, because by then she had a 3.9 GPA and a list of schools that made my chest tight with a pride I'd never once felt directed at myself. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for one strange beat, my stomach did the thing it always does before bad news, that small drop you feel before you even know why. I opened the door, and there they were. Carl and Deborah Hartwell, 17 years older, standing on my porch the way I had once stood on theirs, except they weren't carrying a suitcase. They were carrying, I would learn within the next 10 minutes, a folder. My father had gone gray and thinner through the shoulders. My mother's hair was a careful, practiced silver blonde now, and she wore a cardigan I recognized as the kind she'd always saved for occasions where appearance mattered most. They both smiled, the wide, performed smile of people who had rehearsed this moment in a car somewhere, probably for the entire 4-hour drive. "Lena," my mother said, like the 17 years were a comma instead of a wall. "Look at you, look at this house." I stood in the doorway and did not invite them in immediately. I want to be honest about the feeling in that moment, because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was a kind of vertigo, the strange dissonance of seeing two people who had been frozen in my memory at one specific, terrible moment suddenly standing in front of me, older, smiling, acting as though that moment had simply never happened. "What are you doing here?" I said. Not a question, really, more of a fact I needed confirmed. My father cleared his throat in the way he always used to write before delivering something he considered reasonable. "We were hoping we could come in and talk, as a family." Behind me, I heard Marin's chair scrape back from the counter. She had heard exactly 2 stories about her grandparents in her entire life, both of them short, both of them ending the same way. They made their choice, and we made ours. She had never met them. She was looking at them now with the careful, assessing expression she got right before a test she hadn't studied for. I let them in, not out of warmth, but out of the same instinct that made Pearl always say you let people show you who they are before you decide what to do about it. I led them to the kitchen table, the same kind of ordinary, lived-in table, where I had once tried to tell my own parents I was scared and pregnant and needed them. The irony of that wasn't lost on me. I don't think it occurred to either of them at all. My mother sat down and immediately started talking about the drive, about traffic on the interstate, about how lovely my house was, how lovely the neighborhood was, like she was a guest at a dinner party, instead of 2 people who'd put a suitcase on a porch in the rain. My father set the folder on the table between us, squared it carefully, the way he used to square his coffee mug right before delivering bad news disguised as reason. "We'll get right to it," he said. "We know this is unexpected." "It is," I said. He opened the folder. Inside were several pages, dense with print, the kind of document that's been drafted by somebody who charges by the hour. He explained, in the flat, business-like voice I remembered from childhood, that the regional auto parts company he'd worked for had gone through a round of layoffs 2 years prior. That his pension, the one I'd grown up hearing about as the reward for 30 years of quiet, dutiful work, had been restructured in a way that cut the payout nearly in half. That my mother's teaching pension, smaller to begin with, wasn't enough on its own. That the house on Birchwood Lane carried a second mortgage I'd never known existed, taken out, he admitted almost without shame, to cover a bad investment a financial advisor had talked him into years back. That medical bills from a hip surgery the year before had eaten through what savings remained. "We're not asking for charity," my father said, and I noticed his hand tighten slightly on the folder. "We've thought this through carefully. We'd like you to co-sign a loan, a substantial one, to consolidate everything, get us back on stable footing. We've already spoken to the bank. They said with a co-signer with your income and your husband's business, the terms would be very reasonable." I sat very still. Across the kitchen, I could feel Marin's eyes on the side of my face, and Eli had gone quiet over his fraction worksheet, sensing without fully understanding that something important was happening at the table. "How much?" I said. My mother answered before my father could, which told me everything about whose idea this trip really was. 140,000. It sounds like a great deal, I know, but Lena, your father's pension, my pension, it just isn't what we thought it would be. We're not young anymore. We don't have time to build it back the slow way. I want to tell you honestly what went through my mind in that silence, because it wasn't simple. There was a flicker, just a flicker, of the 18-year-old girl who used to sit at a different kitchen table desperate for any sign that these two people cared whether she sank or swam. That flicker is the part of you that childhood never fully lets go of, no matter how solid the life you've built since. But underneath that flicker, steadier and louder, was 17 years of evidence, stacked up like bricks, and I had spent too long laying each one carefully to let a folder and a rehearsed smile knock the wall down in 10 minutes. "You came here," I said slowly, "to ask me to co-sign $140,000 in debt." "We're family," my father said, and something in his tone sharpened, the old flatness creeping back in, the voice that used to mean the real conversation was about to start. "Families help each other, Lena. That's what we're trying to do here, help each other." I almost laughed. I want to be honest that the urge was there, sharp and sudden, because the word family coming out of his mouth in my kitchen, at my table, 17 years after he put a suitcase on a porch in the rain, was almost too absurd to process as anything but dark comedy. "Did you bring this same speech to anyone else first?" I asked. "Or was I the only stop on the tour?" My mother's face did something complicated, a flash of something that might have been guilt if I'd believed she was capable of it anymore. My father's jaw tightened. "We don't have anyone else to ask," he said. "You're our daughter." There it was. The whole architecture of my childhood, summarized in 5 words, delivered 17 years late, only now with a number attached. I had been their daughter exactly when it was useful for them to remember it, and not one day before. Marin spoke up then, and I want to tell you about this moment carefully, because it's the part of the night I think about most. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She simply set down the brochure she'd been holding, looked at my father with the same calm, level expression I'd watched her use on substitute teachers who tried to push her around, and said, "Did you really kick my mom out when she was pregnant with me?" The kitchen went very quiet. My father's mouth opened, then closed. "That's not exactly," my mother started. "Was it raining?" Marin asked. Not unkindly, just precisely. The way you ask a question when you already know the answer, and you simply want to watch the person you're asking decide whether to lie to your face. Nobody answered her for a long moment. Eli had gone completely still beside her, watching his sister with something like awe. I want you to understand that I had not told my children every detail of that night. I had given them the shape of it, the fact of it, enough so they understood why their grandparents weren't part of our lives. But I had never told either of them about the rain, about the suitcase with the daisy sticker, about the deadbolt clicking shut behind me. Marin had pieced that part together herself, somewhere over the years, the way kids do, filling in gaps from overheard half-conversations, and the particular way I went quiet whenever Birchwood Lane came up. "It was raining," I said quietly, looking at my father, not at her. "Yes." My father's face had gone a shade paler. My mother reached for her cardigan collar, the old nervous gesture I remembered from childhood, smoothing something that didn't need smoothing. "We were young parents ourselves once," my father said, and his voice had lost some of its earlier flatness, replaced by something closer to defensiveness. "We did what we thought was right at the time. Times were different." "You didn't do what you thought was right," I said, and my own voice surprised me with how calm it stayed. "You did what looked right to the neighbors. There's a difference, and you taught me that difference yourselves on a Sunday evening at a kitchen table very much like this one." My mother's eyes had gone wet, the performed kind of crying I remembered so well from childhood, the kind that arrived exactly when an argument needed softening, never a moment before. We've thought about that night every day for 17 years, Lena. Every single day. We were wrong. We know we were wrong. You've never once said that to me before tonight, I said. Not in 17 years. Not when Marin was born. Not when Eli was born. Not at a single birthday, a single Christmas, a single ordinary Tuesday when a phone call would have cost you nothing. You're saying it now, at this table, with a lone folder open in front of you. I think you can understand why that timing matters to me. My father's hands had gone still on the folder. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all, and I watched something flicker across his face that might, in a kinder story, have been the beginning of real shame. I don't know if it was. I've stopped trying to guess at what goes on behind that particular set of eyes. So that's a no, he said finally, and his voice had gone hard again, the warmth dropping away as fast as it had appeared, like a mask sliding back into place once it became clear the soft approach wasn't landing. After everything, you're going to sit in this beautiful house and tell your own parents no. I built this house, I said. I built it with a man you never once invited to dinner, raising 2 children you've never once asked the names of until tonight, on a salary I earned finishing a degree I paid for myself, 1 or 2 classes at a time, for 6 years, while you were on a cruise ship sending us a card with no names on it. I am not the 18-year-old you put on that porch. I want you to understand that clearly before you leave tonight, because I think some part of you drove 4 hours believing she'd still be standing there. My mother had started crying in earnest now, not the practiced kind, something rower underneath it, and for one brief moment I felt the old pull, the muscle memory of a daughter trained for 18 years to fix her mother's tears before anything else in the room mattered. I let the moment pass through me without acting on it. That, more than anything else in that conversation, was the proof of how far I'd actually come. What about the children? My father tried, gesturing vaguely toward Marin and Eli, like they were leverage instead of people. Don't you want them to know their grandparents? We could be part of their lives. We could still fix this. I looked at my daughter, 17 years old, sitting at my kitchen table having just watched 2 strangers who shared her blood try to extract money from her mother using guilt as the currency. I looked at my son, 13, quietly absorbing a lesson about people and money that I never once wanted him to need this early. They already know their grandmother, I said. Her name was Pearl Voss. She opened a door for 2 scared kids in the rain and never once in 17 years asked us to pay her back for it. That's the only grandparent either of them has ever needed. My father stood up slowly. He looked, for the first time all evening, genuinely old, the folder still in his hand, his shoulders rounded in a way I didn't remember from childhood. So that's it, he said. We drove 4 hours for nothing. You drove 4 hours, I said, standing as well, to ask your daughter to co-sign debt for the first time in 17 years that you've asked her for anything at all. I think you got exactly what that trip was worth. My mother gathered her purse, still crying, and at the door she turned back one more time, and for a brief moment I thought she might say something real, something that wasn't a performance or a strategy. Instead she said, "We're still your parents, Lena. That doesn't just go away." No, I agreed. It doesn't go away, but it also doesn't come with a guarantee that I owe you anything just because of it. You taught me that lesson yourselves. I learned it well. They left. I stood at the window and watched their car pull out of the cul-de-sac, the same kind of careful, controlled exit my father had always favored. No slammed doors, no raised voices on his way out, just a quiet, dignified retreat from a battle he'd badly misjudged. Daniel came home 20 minutes later to find all 3 of us still sitting at the kitchen table, the fraction worksheet forgotten, the college brochures pushed aside. I told him everything, and he listened the way he always had, steady, unhurried, his hand finding mine across the table the same way it had found my knee in his uncle's truck 17 years earlier. "You okay?" he asked once I'd finished. I thought about it honestly, the way I always try to with him. "Yeah," I said, "I really am." Marin reached over and squeezed my other hand, and Eli, still 13 and not quite sure what to do with his hands in a moment like this, just leaned his head against my shoulder for a second, the way he used to when he was small. I never heard from my parents again after that night. No follow-up call, no second attempt, no letter trying to soften what had happened. I think, in the end, they understood that the door they'd watched close had finally, fully, locked itself from the other side, the same way theirs once had. I don't regret saying no. I want to be honest that there was no triumphant satisfaction in it either, no fireworks moment of revenge. There was only the quiet, settled feeling of a woman who had spent 17 years building a table sturdy enough that nobody could shake it loose from underneath her anymore, not even the two people who'd built the first table she ever sat at. Marin got into her first-choice university that fall, on a partial scholarship she earned entirely on her own merit, the same way her father had once saved for a trade certification with a thermos of sun tea, and a steady kind of hope nobody had handed him either. Eli is 14 now, still doing fractions, still leaning his head against my shoulder more than he probably realizes he's old enough to be embarrassed about. Daniel's company has 18 employees now, and he still answers his own phone for the customers who have been with him since the one-van days, because he never forgot what it felt like to need somebody to simply show up. I still have that daisy sticker suitcase, actually. I kept it, the same instinct that made me keep the Christmas card all those years ago. It sits on a shelf in our garage now, full of old keepsakes, Marin's baby clothes, Eli's first pair of shoes, photographs of Pearl holding both of my children on her lap at a beach somewhere, all three of them laughing at something none of us remember anymore. The suitcase that once meant the worst night of my life now just holds the proof of the life that came after it. And there is something in that I find more satisfying than any check I could have signed at that kitchen table ever would have been. That's my story. One suitcase in the rain, 17 years of building something solid out of nothing, and a folder full of debt that finally, found its way to a door I was strong enough to close. If someone in your life only remembers you exist when they need something from you, let tonight be the night you stop answering on their schedule. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.